Thank you. And thank you so much, everyone, for spending your weekend with us. It is such a pleasure to be here in this beautiful venue, in this beautiful city. So thank you for sharing your morning with us. I am so excited to be in conversation with Neel and Sanjana, who I think are, well, you'll find out soon enough more about them. But I honestly, genuinely believe that there is a fresh new generation of Indian writers in America, and their voices are so different from the generation that preceded them. And I'd love to talk to you all a little bit about that as well. Let's get started right away. Let's talk about pressure. There is a lot of pressure, I think, on conformity, especially when it comes to being a part of a diasporic community. Indians are frequently referred to as the model minority, for example. A lot of fiction, both on screen and on paper, has tended to deal with pressure as academic pressure, pressure to be successful, pressure to make your name in the right way, in the right spaces, and that sort of thing. And I'm very, very interested in how both of your books deal with pressure. So Sanjana, I want to start with you. Tell us about the aspirational quality that comes out in your book, Gold Diggers, and how you choose to satirize that. And maybe also talk to us a little bit about why specifically this was a subject you chose to focus on.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that you said conformity, because it's not just about success, and I think often people think of the model minority experience as just being about getting into college and like how hard it is to take the SAT when you're 14 years old. But I think there's something much more insidious, and I do think it's about kind of beating people into conformity. But my novel, Gold Diggers, opens with a group of teenagers living in the suburbs of Atlanta, and they're sort of like self-cannibalizing. They are elbowing each other, trying to achieve initially the academic success. They steal from each other, they do injury to each other, and as you say, the book sort of treats that with some seriousness, but I do satirize it, and it follows them through their 20s and kind of the legacy of what that pressure does. I felt drawn to it as a topic because I think there are sort of two ways to respond to this like model minority main narrative. One is to try to ignore it and just veer away from it and make a really conscious decision to avoid it. Another way is to write right into it. And I felt that this is a thing that we as a community often take ourselves really seriously about, and I think it's just ridiculous. And so I feel like the inherent absurdity of it was just calling out to be satirized and treated with a kind of lightness. I think that humor is realism. I think absurdism is realism, and I, having grown up in like a high-pressure environment and gotten distance from it, felt like that angle of distance gave me a way to lampoon. Yeah.
And was there a lot of pressure on you growing up?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it comes from a well-meaning place. Something that I think we don't talk about a lot is it's not just tiger parents, it's a legacy of pressure that you have to go through a lot to get here. The green card process, the visa process, the fact that many Indians in particular come through on H-1B visas. You already have to be at such a high achieving level and often have class and caste privilege to get here. And so of course you're gonna pass on that very particular and often narrow picture of how to be onto the next generation. And that kind of narrowing, I think, really restricts our collective imagination. Yeah.
Speaking of how to be, tell me how to be, Neel. Tell me about the kind of pressure that you are dealing with in Tell Me How to Be, because you have two incredibly fascinating characters who are, in a sense, kind of coming out to each other through the course of the novel. So tell us a little bit about Tell Me How to Be.
So the book was kind of born out of my own feelings of otherness for being queer, being South Asian, growing up in a small, kind of white, homophobic town. But there's also this theme of goodness in the book, and the first line of the book, I think, if I can remember it, is, "My mother always told me to be a good boy. I suspect she knew that I wasn't." And my whole identity growing up was the bad child. My sister was the good child, and I was the bad child. If there were rules, I was gonna break them. I didn't get great grades. I flunked out of college, and then I lied about flunking out of college, and that became a thing. And then I had bad credit, and you're not supposed to have bad credit as a South Asian. You're supposed to pay your bills on time. And at every point in my life, I was just always stumbling, and I was watching other people succeed. And so that theme of goodness kind of runs throughout the book, but I also was thinking about my mother and what she might have experienced. And I don't really have many stories of my mother when she was younger. I know so much about my dad. I know that he streaked across campus. I know that he was a daredevil. I know that he had girlfriends and that he failed a year in med school and then had to repeat it. And there's always this sense of like humor surrounding it, this kind of boys will be boys kind of thing, where men get to have indiscretions and women don't. And the only thing I know about my mom is something my aunts told me, which was that there was a man on a motorcycle who used to visit her out. So she would be on her balcony, kind of like Romeo and Juliet, and he would visit her. And she vehemently denies this. She's like, there was no, but my mom was like a hot little thing. Like she was really pretty. Like I know there were men who were admiring her, and I was like, I was always wondering like, what's her story? But she never gets to tell it because she had to be a certain way, and there were consequences for that. And so I kind of started to build this story about a mother and son both kind of dealing with these traumatic pasts and kind of keeping their truths from each other and then ultimately having to come together.
What did your mom think of Tell Me How to Be?
Oh yeah, she loved it, but it's so funny how parents can be aloof. Like, I don't think she thinks this is based on her. Like, she really doesn't. She's like, I mean, I don't agree with what she did at the end and da-da-da. I'm like, okay. But she did like it, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your own coming out story, if you're comfortable talking about it?
Yeah. My coming out story, it was complicated. I, felt a lot of shame and fear about being gay, and it wasn't even so much about my parents, because my parents were my mom's been getting her hair done since like the 80s. She knows gay people. And she never, never had a problem with it. My dad also, he would always say, gay people, they're very nice, they're very nice people. But it was other people. It was the community, surrounding them. And what are they gonna think? That was always my fear, was I don't want my parents to be exiled because of who I am. So I kept it inside for so many years, and I kind of came out in stages, first to my friends, and then to other people. And then I actually did an interview when my first book came out, and I was very candid about my sexuality. And I didn't know that my dad would ever read it. It was for electric literature. I just didn't know, but he found it and read it. And I got a phone call at 10:30 at night, and when you get a call that late, it's because something bad happened or because you did something bad. So my dad was like, is this true? And I said yes. And the first thing he said is, I love you. And the first thing my mom said in the background is, who else knows? And she had to go into PR mode and get ahead of the story. But I'm very fortunate that, they are totally accepting. Yeah.
I'm so happy to hear that. So another aspect of this pressure, and this is even true of Indians in India, is what will other people say? So your mom's first question was along those lines, who else knows about it, and what do I have to do like damage control broadly? So I'm also kind of interested in how did the Indian community react to both of you writing the novels that you did? Because when we talk about pressure, there is also that pressure, right? What is the kind of book that the good Indian is meant to write? And you're both clearly resisting those pressures. So I'm really interested in how the community has responded to both of you. So Sanjana, let's start with you.
I mean, like Neel, I was the bad sibling and had to push back against a lot of like anti-art energy in the community and in my house. And so there's something really kind of ironic about as soon as it's an achievement, the community actually responded pretty positively because now I look respectable, but the material in my book is not respectable. There's sex, drugs, and not a lot of rock and roll, but there's like bad stuff in the book. But because it's between two covers and it has a nice blurb on the front, and it looks more wrapped up. So there has been like this kind of, we can digest it as an achievement. But I have also gotten some pushback because I think I'm asked this almost everywhere I go, and I'm sure you get this too. Why would you write something about how the community is bad when there's already bad stuff about us out there? We're already battling stereotypes, and people don't see us fully. And I find that an almost offensive question because A, it's not something that a white writer ever has to deal with. It's not something that straight writers have to deal with when they portray straight people. But it wildly restricts what you can do, and it makes your work not about art, but about representation. And I did not write this book in order to put Indians on the page. Indians are on the page everywhere. I was interested in putting a particular aesthetic experience on the page, and Karan Mahajan, the Indian writer, talks about how frequently, like when we get reviewed, people often don't talk about our sentences. People don't talk about the artistic components of what we've done. They talk about how we've added to some sort of collective experience. And so I think the reception has been really mixed. Some of it has been, why are you making us look bad? Some of it has been, well, it's great that you are like another feather in our cap. Yeah.
Neel, do you want to come in on that?
I've had, a lot of people, fortunately, have been really supportive. I think, especially the queer South Asian community, it's been amazing. I get emails, I get DMs. I got a DM from a woman who read my book on a trip home to introduce her parents to her girlfriend. And I just cried when I read that because that was so special. So I can't say that I also just don't I hit the block button. So I don't even but I can see what Sanjana's saying. I don't always paint South Asians in a positive light, but I like that. Whenever I make a new friend, it's usually because they do something bad or they say something bad. I'm drawn to that, and I think it's because I've had to deal with this image of perfection my whole life and having to live up to it, and I'd rather just do away with it altogether. And I think it's so important for books like these to exist because it helps other South Asians feel less alone and hey, I'm like this, or I've talked to so many other people who are like, oh yeah, I used to make fake report cards, which I did too. I was good at it. I should start a business.
You actually could start a business with that.
Should we do that?
Yeah, so let's talk about the American dream a little bit, because I think, is it fair to say that you guys have a completely different American dream from the previous generation of Indian Americans, Indian American writers?
Oh, that's interesting. In what sense are you thinking of?
So the idea of success, I don't want to play into the stereotypes that you just mentioned, but the idea of success could at some point have basically meant become a doctor, become successful, get into an Ivy League college, that sort of thing. But I feel like you both have chosen very different paths and your characters have chosen very different paths. So is it fair to say that we're talking about two very specific generations of Indian Americans, and your generation has kind of expanded what success might mean?
I think that we're starting to, but I also, I speak to a lot of, when I talk to audiences of South Asians and Asian Americans, it's often young people, and I just spoke to students at a high school who read my book in class, and I think a lot of the reason that their teacher assigned my book is because they wanted them to think about the pressure that they were under, and my book offers, I think, is in conversation with that. And a lot of those students, they're high schoolers, they're teenagers, it looked like they were in exactly the same position. They were, I think a lot of them seemed frankly depressed. I think again, it's this constriction of imagination. There are just a lot more ways to be a person and ways to be a happy person and a full person in the world. And I think we do, as a community, continue to restrict that picture. I think artistically, we're in a different moment. I think artists are starting to do, because there are just more of us. When the denominator is higher, there's more experimentation. The writer Volhini Vara just came out with a wild, maximalist novel that blends science fiction with a Dalit coming-of-age story, and that book could not exist 15 years ago. So I do think artistically we're doing different things, but I think we have a long way to go as we move through. Yeah,
I totally agree. I see us making the same mistakes. My sister has kids, And she always tells me some of her South Asian friends are like these tiger moms, and they're just like, their kid has to be perfect and has to do all these different things, and it's so competitive now. Even my mom, and I'm like, why are you talking? Like, my mom's like, yes, it's so hard these days to get into college. You have to be even, you know, it's like, I'm like, thank God I don't have to deal with that, you know. But I do think like I have internalized a lot from my father always kind of told me, you know, Neil, in this country, if you're brown and you're successful, people will treat you better. And I saw it too. I saw people change how they acted around my father when they found out he was a doctor, or they saw what kind of car he drove. And I internalized this idea, especially being queer, that if I'm rich and gay, then that's better. And so it's something I struggle with all the time, like, hence the bad credit. So I'm trying to unlearn that I have to be, because now I'm an artist, but now I have to be a rich artist. You know, I have to do TV and film and do all this stuff, and sometimes I ask myself, am I doing it for the right reasons, you know?
Yeah, I think the biggest heartbreak for me growing up in a community that supposedly valued education was realizing that in a lot of cases, the education wasn't about intellectual expansion or like the exploration of selfhood. It was about using an education in order to get a credential, in order to be accepted. And it is a safety thing, like assimilation is a safety thing, but yeah.
There's always that question, how much does that pay? Like, you know, that's always in the background. Like, oh, Mom, I got this thing. Are they going to pay you? And how much? So I just start making up numbers.
Let's talk about this thing that you talked about being a TV writer. I know both of you are working on very exciting projects, and I'd love to hear more about both of them. And specifically what that experience is like, moving from writing fiction to also adapting your own fiction for the screen. But also, I do want to kind of ask you guys to tell me your opinion on this, because I find that a lot of Indian content that is made for an OTT platform, then therefore like a very wide global readership, hasn't made the transition that you guys have made. Like, hasn't necessarily crossed from telling the arranged marriage stories or the, you know, how to get into college stories into the kinds of worlds that you guys are occupying. And I can't wait for your adaptations, because I'm sure that will go a long way in making that transition. But what has that process been like?
Yeah, you know, there's something really pure about writing fiction. Like, you're not necessarily thinking about an audience. The second you start developing for TV, you're thinking about an audience. There's just way more money in Hollywood, like it costs so much. So the higher up you go, the more broad you get. So that's why you have these stories about arranged marriages and, you know, doctors and things like that. And so my experience has been interesting because TV, they want you to like have everything figured out, you know? And like, I don't know how you write, Sanjena, but I'm like, I start with a line, and then that begets another line and another line. I don't outline. I hate outline. It's so annoying. And then you have to like, but what's this beat and what's part 2B? And I'm like, I don't even think like that. But you have to do that, and you have to convince all these executives that this is great and that this is going to make tons of money, because that's really ultimately what it's about, is money. Whereas I feel like in publishing, like they'll take chances on books. Like there are a lot of publishers who love to publish kind of esoteric stuff that may not make money, but they just are so passionate about it. So.
Yeah, I mean, you're the publisher, but I feel like nothing makes money, right? Like we don't make money. But yeah, television is necessarily, there are a lot more people involved is the other thing I would add to that. Like when you let in collaborators and producers and execs, it's just so many more people, and so it does become, I think I can see how a lot of things get diluted. And I was talking to my friends the other day that like some of the best television is auteurish television. Like Donald Glover puts his stamp on Atlanta. That's his project. Phoebe Waller-Bridge owns all of Fleabag. You very rarely get to do that in TV in particular. You sometimes see it in film. But I also think we're in a moment where we're starting to see explosiveness. The film Everything Everywhere All at Once, directed by Daniels, is, I think, one of the most important pieces of Asian American art that has come out in like a decade. It is like a story about the multiverse. It has a take on the high-pressure Asian mom, but it is incredibly weird in the way it deals with it. I think again, it's like bigger the denominator is, the more risks you're allowed to take.
Yeah, and I think there's so many like executives. I don't know. I'm so impressed. Like you're 24. You just sound so. Because when I was 24, I didn't even. That's another story. But there's just a lot of young, like energetic executives coming up now who come from all different backgrounds. You know, queer, brown, black, and so there is kind of new energy being pumped in, and so I think we're headed in the right direction.
And white execs feel guilty. So now people are willing to make more kinds of art that they might not understand because people genuinely, they're like, well, I'm supposed to invest in DEI, so I better do something different.
Yeah. I don't know if this has ever come up with you, but like I got a note, I was meeting with some executives and they're talking about a project and they're like, well, we'd love more cultural specificity. I hate that. So I literally was like, okay. And then I made a note and I wrote, make more Indian.
Add some spice, add some mangoes.
Yeah, samosas.
Yeah, totally.
So let's quickly tell everyone what you guys are working on as well. So you are adapting Tell Me How to Be.
Yeah, I'm adapting that for TV. I have a film in development as well with Lily Singh attached to star, and it's based on a screenplay that I wrote. It's a sex comedy about like a virgin who has to teach sex ed to a bunch of like horny high school students. So I have that, and I'm also I'm in a writer's room right now for a project, but it's actually an Audible project, which I didn't know that they did writers' rooms for, but that was cool. So, yeah.
And Sanjana?
Yeah, I'm working on my second book, which I don't talk about because I feel like I jinx it. And I've been working on a bunch of short stories. They come out in little magazines, and they have tiny readerships, and therefore I can do weirder, crazier things with them. And then I have the TV adaptation with Mindy Kaling, and I just co-wrote a pilot with a couple of friends about high school debate called Master Debaters, and we are very hopeful that hits the screen.
You were a high school debater too, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And that comes up in your book as well.
It does, yeah. I mean, it's a little like that one time at band camp kind of vibes. You have extremely competitive, like intense kids, but they're also just like going to debate camp to make out and like drink raspberry Smirnoff behind the dumpster.
You spoke a little bit about the guilt of representation, and I think this is a good point for us to also talk about what that is like. I think we spoke about what it's like to have readership within the diasporic community and have feedback from the community, but I think there is also a different kind of pressure that comes from the non-home community, if I'm using the right phrasing. So what I mean by that is there is a burden or a responsibility on writers of non-mainstream or non-white backgrounds to be explanatory, to say, okay, this is what Indian culture is like, like a little capsule, you can swallow this and now you know all about Indian culture. And I'm interested in what you both think about that burden as well, the explanatory burden or the representation burden.
Yeah. I think it comes down to a lot of really small choices. So, like in my first workshop in graduate school, I turned in a piece that was set in Bombay. It was about like monsoon in Bombay and this like haunted painting that comes to life. And it mostly took itself for granted. Like it was about brown people in India. It was not trying to explain itself. But I had italicized Hindi words. And this woman in my workshop, who's a Northern Cheyenne woman, was like, in her workshop letter to me, she was like, why did you do that? Like, it's my job to enter your piece and figure it out, and I never italicize any words from indigenous languages, and like, you should consider not doing that. And I was like, oh, I never thought about that. I thought that was a thing I had to set off. So I think you have like microcraft choices. But a lot of it is just like, it's a character question, right? Do you let your characters breathe fully, speak to each other the way that you would speak to your friends when there's not a white listenership in the room? I didn't really intend to do this, but my book, there are like very few speaking parts for non-Asian American characters, and I wasn't like trying to make a radical point. I was just writing about an insular Asian bubble within Atlanta, and it's the reason I thought it was never going to be on TV, because like there's just not a lot of parts for white people in it. But I think it all just comes down to craft choices. Like, do you let your characters breathe on the page?
Yeah, that's kind of, I don't feel like I really again, I'm not thinking about the audience, and I definitely don't feel like I think about a white audience because I'm known to say some edgy things. And I remember my dad, when he read my book, he was afraid. He was like, but isn't your agent white? Like, isn't your editor white? Like, are they gonna be offended? I was like, but they don't identify with that, what I'm talking about, with racism. They're not identifying with that, so no. But yeah, I mean, I think I also like to let the characters breathe, but I do sometimes feel like I catch myself doing things like, a character will be drinking chai randomly. I'm like, is she drinking chai too much? Like, I mean, it's good, but it ain't that good. Like, so I'll replace it with wine.
That's interesting. Speaking also of the burden of responsibility, Sanjana, you had an essay in this magazine called The Drift, in which you spoke extensively about that burden, and maybe you can just give us a little intro to what your thoughts on that piece were.
Yeah, sure. So the piece was called, I think, Good Immigrant Novels, and it started with a reflection on the writing of Jhumpa Lahiri, particularly her first story collection, The Interpreter of Maladies, less than the namesake in the later work. But I think, like, probably like Neil, when we were growing up, that was who we were handed, you know? She was the one we had to look at to be like, that she got to be an artist. In my house, there was also a lot of Rushdie. There were other books, but it was often, like in 10th grade, The Interpreter of Maladies was on the reading list. And I think it's very significant that it was on a reading list in a world literature class when it's an American book. But it was there because it was like, it's an easy entry point into Indian culture. Lahiri, I think, is a lush and beautiful stylist. I think she is incredibly talented at the genre of psychological realism, which is only partly what I do. But it's very telling to me that a lot of her protagonists are children, sometimes white children, white women who have love affairs with men and get to experience, with Indian men, and get to experience the exotic thrill of that. Or older people. I think she chooses characters who are incredibly easy to sympathize with and who are sort of open and innocent, and that does make for like a good explanatory piece. Like you will read, there are just a lot of people giving like tours or like explaining maps to characters in these stories. And part of that, I think, is the burden of coming first. Like we do have the advantage of someone else did a little bit of that explanation for us. But I also think some of that comes from like respectability politics and a desire to present well. And the books that matter the most to me are books that dispense with that burden. So like books like White Teeth by Zadie Smith was an incredibly important book for me. Rushdie, who is incredibly offensive in a way that I think is incredible. The book that I think ended up being the most important to me from South Asian kind of canon is The Buddha of Suburbia by Hanif Qureshi, which is an incredibly sexy and impertinent coming-of-age novel about this bisexual, biracial man growing up in London. No one was going to put that on a 10th grade reading syllabus. Like, there's like an orgy with like a bunch of theater people in it. Like, that's not getting taught. But it's hot and funny and interesting and deeply not respectable. And so I took a lot of refuge in writers like Qureshi and writers from other traditions like Philip Roth. Even like Toni Morrison explicitly wrote against this idea. She said often, like, I wasn't trying to just do Black is beautiful because it wasn't always beautiful. And that's not my job. Yeah.
Neil, I also remember this wonderful essay. Was it in the Paris Review that you wrote about what it is like to be an Indian in a time of actual racism that's happening in the world?
Yeah.
I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the representational politics that brought you to writing a piece like that.
I think I wrote that piece around the kind of collective awakening we all were having, which should have happened a long time ago, with regards to race. And I was thinking about the way I experience race within the South Asian community and the rampant and ugly anti-Blackness that I still continue to see, that is layered with a lot of things like social class. You know, I tend to see it in these sort of communities of wealthy Republican South Asians who think that, you know, well, I'm gonna vote for Trump because I wanna hold on to my money, and then, you know, and I remember specifically I was at a wedding on the East Coast, and this Indian uncle, it was a wedding of a wealthy family, Indian family, this Indian uncle who probably also is wealthy, he was swirling his wine. And he was swirling it so much, I was like, is it a whirlpool? Like, what are you doing? So he was just dramatically swirling his wine. He's like looking around, he's like, see, we're just like the whites. And I was like, wow, colonialism has you messed up. Like, you have a lot of work to do. And I think South Asians came here and they got this kind of like unofficial guidebook on race. And it's like, under white people, it's like, please us, we're your boss, we'll help you, we'll keep you. Under Asians, this is your biggest competition, do not trust them, you know? Under like Latinx, native, indigenous people, ignore. And then under black people, see white people for help. And I think Indians just kind of ingested that, absorbed that. And yeah, it's something that really angers me. I still see it today. There seems to be this idea that, well, we're greater than, or we're the good immigrants, we're the people that white people like. So.
Well, I'm really glad we didn't come to the end of the session without talking about Indian uncles and aunties. We have about 15 minutes left for audience questions. So if there's any hands up, I think there might be a mic that's going around at this point.
This might be politically incorrect. You use the term South Asian rather than Indian American, and I'm curious about what other countries in South Asia, whether you know artists from those areas, or just maybe explore the idea of why this term rather than Indian American.
Well, you know what's interesting? I grew up just calling myself an Indian American. And then there was that confusion of like, well, Native American, and then South Asian still feels relatively new to me. Like, I still refer to myself as an Indian American often. And so I don't even know, like a like, yes, it's Pakistan too, and I mean, you could take over because I'm starting to run out of energy.
I mean,
I can tell you what the countries are that come under the Indian subcontinent or South Asia. It's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, and the Maldives. These are the 7 countries.
Yeah, for me it was when I went to college, I think there was a kind of collective conversation about pan-South Asianness, not just like, let's talk about only Indians, and Indians tend to have a kind of like cultural hegemony over, I mean, a geopolitical hegemony over that region as well. And I think there were a lot of like South Asian societies on campuses, and it was, I think, a movement in academic studies, area studies, that changed that conversation. When I'm talking about Indian Americans, I'm often trying to make a distinction about the particular like class location that a lot of Indian Americans have. But when I'm talking about South Asians, I'm often talking about a kind of shared cultural experience.
There are a couple of hands here, so let's go to the first row.
So I don't have a question. I just want to say that I'm in my mid-60s. My husband just turned 70. We are both originally from India. And we see ourselves vilified quite a bit in books, in TV shows as, you know, the tiger parents. And we had to fight a stereotype when our girls were growing up in school, because we were always, you know, the school thought we were the pushy kind of tiger parents, which we were not. We have a child who's a math and science one, and the other one is in the arts full-time, and we pushed both of them in each of their directions. And she's a curator. Admittedly, we are sort of rock stars with her friends. There are not a lot of us like us, but we now know a lot of Indian parents with gay kids who are pretty cool about it. So I just wanted to say we do exist. Just an FYI.
Would either of you
No,
like to
I agree with what you're saying, and I've actually said this. I remember watching Hassan Minhaj's stage show, and I just felt like, wow, he's like kind of going in on his parents. And I think as like young writers and creators, we're so wrapped up in our own angst that yes was attached to our relationships with our parents that we do forget that our parents are people and they have things that they're dealing with, and that yes, not all parents, like I get drunk with my parents all the time. I'm like, I have such a cool relationship with them. But yeah, there were things that they expected of me, but I think they expected those things of me because they were afraid to mess up and they didn't want me, I mean, I did mess up many times. But yeah, no, I'm glad you pointed that because I feel the same way.
There's a hand there. Oh, sorry.
I have a question. My children, they were born here, grew up here, they are professionals and probably much older than you are. But when they write, if their names are not there, being not in the literary field, or even if it's a literary piece, if their names are not there, no one can tell of their ethnicity or how they grew up. You are in a fiction field, and I was wondering if your names were not there on your writing. If I read it, could I tell that it's written by someone of Indian ethnicity? Does it
Yes.
reflect your bringing up, your parental this, or whatever?
Yes, I think for both of us, having read Neil's work, I think both of us are writing about a particular cultural experience and are not trying to hide that.
Yeah.
Yeah, this has been fascinating to me for a number of reasons, one of which was what this lady just said. I belong to this generation that has appreciated you guys. But more importantly, I was also interested in the South Asian label, because I worked with the Denver Art Museum in the Asian Art Department. And as far as the Asian Art Department in the Art Museum is concerned, their focus, because of what the environment of America is to focus on the Far East. That would be called Far East in I don't know how many politically incorrect labels I'm going to bring by saying that, or the Middle East, you know. So the thing is that India is a bigger concept than the Indian country that it is today. And that is why South Asia makes more sense, because the similarities between the regions that you pointed out are so deep that to simply say I'm Indian American is saying like I'm Gujarati American. Excuse me, Gujarat is as big as the United Kingdom. And you're calling yourself what? So I always have to think about and encourage people to think about the fact that India itself is a huge space, geographically, culturally, so enriched that it doesn't make sense to narrow it down. And I think it's very, very important. I hear what you're saying, and I find it wonderful that you feel able to speak about this. I remember coming to America to a small town, Texas, from Delhi, and finding that the lady, a daughter of someone who was my husband's host family, says to me, "How lucky are you that you had an arranged marriage?" Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I'm not sure I did the right thing anyway. What are you talking about? You're the lucky one. You get to choose. And in the 70s, she said to me, I need to have the Mr. Right propose to me. I can't propose. And that was a culture shock that I haven't gotten over yet.
Thank you for that context. Thank you.
Hi, I'd love to hear Neil about one or two writers that really kind of shaped your style growing up and your writing style. And then Sanjena, I love, like, every review about your book is just about your, like, they all mention, like, the razor sharp wit. And I'd like to hear, like, who are a couple of writers that really shaped that voice for you and helped hone in on all of that comedy with, like, handling things like that.
Yeah, so I did discover Jabal Lahiri when I was in college, and a friend recommended her, and I did actually really fall in love with her prose, but I didn't necessarily identify with what she was writing about. You know, these sort of I get the sense that there was a lot of isolation and and I wasn't isolated, like I was out there in the streets. But so that was what got me on the path. But actually, it was when I discovered Raymond Carver that I really started to, I loved his stories and I loved the surprising elements of them. I love surprises. And then I started going down this rabbit hole of like reading stories in the New Yorker and Mary Gateskill and Joyce Carol Oates. And then I discovered Junot Diaz and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And that was when I kind of really, because I was really trying to do knockoff Jhumpa Lahiri for like a long time. I was getting nowhere. And then it was in discovering other voices that I tapped into my own voice. Yeah.
Yeah, for me it was, I mentioned Qureshi, Rushdie, and Zadie Smith. I hadn't read Philip Roth until graduate school, and then I read him, and I think that was when I understood something about what I was doing implicitly. I didn't realize how much Roth influenced a bunch of other writers I cared about. Franzen for social realism. I think particularly around sort of comedy, George Saunders, Laurie Moore, Miranda July, those people have all been really important to me. But I think broadly what my influences have in common is that they don't think anyone is untouchable. I don't think that my interest is not in vilifying a particular generation. My interest is in noting how every human is incredibly flawed, including from my generation, and especially from my generation. And I think all of my favorite writers find a way to be artfully disrespectful about the human condition, which I think is how you are respectful of the human condition.
I love that.
Thank you.
One last question. Okay.
Just ricocheting off the gentleman's question about whether anybody would know that the books were written by a South Asian. Sanjena, you decided to make your main character a male. How'd that happen?
Yeah, poor Neil. My main character is named Neil. Part of it is that I actually wrote large chunks of the novel initially from the other main character's perspective, Anita and her mother, Anjali. And actually, I think demographically, they were just too close to me. I couldn't get distance. But I think a lot of really great fiction is about combining the self and the non-self, what you know and what you don't know. And I was too stuck in what I knew. And so changing a few variables, so magic realism is a way of changing a variable for me, and head hopping into a male character was a way of changing a variable. But it was also like very authentic to me. Like, I don't know what it says that I was more myself as a 15-year-old teenage boy. But I think I grew up around a lot of teenage boys. Maybe that was the high school debate thing, but I think it was a way of expanding what I already had access to and getting a fresh light on it.
And interestingly, Neil also writes from the woman's perspective and is working on something as well. Maybe you want to...
Yeah, I enjoy writing from women's perspectives. I think being queer, I personally don't really identify with a particular gender. I don't know that I would say I'm non-binary or trans, but I don't really identify that way. And as a queer person, I've always been around, like the only safe space was the company of women and girls. And so I kind of have always been around women. And I always say, unlike straight men, I listen when women talk. So I've kind of like absorbed the voices. But I read somewhere that, someone said that like women are good at writing men because women have always had to center men in their lives. And so as a queer person, I've always had to center straight people. So I actually, and even straight men, I like enjoying straight, enjoying straight. Wait a minute, that's for the after hours.
We'll talk about that later.
I enjoy writing straight men as well, because I've had to center all of that in my life.
Right. So on that note, end of a panel with no straight men on it.
Thank you so much, Neel Patel. Thank you, Sanjena Sathian. Thank you, Manasi.